You may be seated.
While I was studying for this lesson, I was working at my table, and behind me was this big bag of cat food because the cats were out of food, but I hadn't opened it yet. And this bag's pretty big, the cat's pretty small, and this cat must have been hungry. I think we forgot to feed him. And he started like sniffing it and trying to get his nose into it. And finally he knocked the whole thing over, and I could hear his teeth grinding against it. And I thought, I don't think you're going to get in there, buddy. And he was at the wrong place. He wanted the blessing of food, but instead of going to the food, he should have been coming to his master because he needed me to open that thing. Finally, I called Monica. I said, Monica, your cats are hungry. They are her cats. So she keeps telling me, oh, you love them. I go, well, that's just because I'm trying to be righteous. But, sometimes I think we find ourselves doing that. We want God's blessing. We want everything God has to offer. And sometimes we go for the blessing and we forget that really where we ought to be going is to God first, because all these blessings come from God, right? And so we're going to look at Esther today. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to Esther. We're going to be there a lot. It's a great biblical story. As I reread Esther, I was just amazed at the intricacy and the subtleties of the story and the plots involved. And so we'll start in Esther chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. There was a lot of wealth and opulence in his palace and in his kingdom. And he spent 180 days, 6 months, showing off his riches to the army and all these nobles. He was really happy about what he had. And this was, by the way, about 130 years after Jerusalem had been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar. Now the Babylonians have been conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And so now, for about 130 years, God's people are living in exile. They're living away from their land, without their temple, without the freedom to worship God the way they used to worship God. And so this is the story of the king, and he's having such a good time. He says that now, after these 180 days, we're going to have a 7-day feast. And he goes on to explain in verses 7 and 8 that this feast is going to be one where I'm not going to have any restrictions on how much people drink. And he tells his eunuchs who are planning the feast, let them drink as much as they want. So he's planning pretty much a drunken party for all his guests. Meanwhile, this is not only the story of living in a pagan land and the story of pagan people, but it's also the story of God's people. And in verse 5 of chapter 2, we have the entry of God's people that are living there. And it says in verse 5, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Lair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. Now, by the way, Kish was the father of Saul. And so we have this Jew named Mordecai, who it says his family was carried away by Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered it, and they'd been living in exile all this time, and he was a descendant of King Saul. And it says in verse 7 that he was bringing up Hadassah, or that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. And the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So for whatever reason, and by the way, I had to think about this, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that his uncle's daughter would be his cousin. And I don't know why it doesn't say cousin here. It obviously was a much younger cousin. And so he took Esther in as his daughter when his uncle died, and and raised her as his very own. And they're living in exile, but they're living in a time that's dark for God's people. The blessing that was promised through Abraham that seemed to come to fruition during the time of the United Kingdom under Saul and David and Solomon, and then started to splinter during the divided kingdom, now just seemed as nothing but false promises and false hope. And they're still living in this land waiting for God, but they really have nothing of what they're hoping for. And so one of the things that we have to think about as God's people is, how do you live in exile? Because one of the things that we understand now is that the United States of America is not our home. Israel is not our home. Brazil, where I went and visited my friends and the missionary team we're supporting, that's not their home. We're waiting for a different home, but in the meantime, we live in exile. And so in Jeremiah chapter 29, he tells them how to live in exile. So listen to verses 4 through 6 out of Jeremiah chapter 29.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, and do not decrease.
So here's what he tells them. He says, when you go to that land, because you're going into exile, I just want you to live there. I want you to marry and have daughters and sons, and I want you to increase. I saw this little cartoon the other day, and it said, one guy sitting there said, well, you only live once. And his friend said, no, you're wrong. You only die once. You live every day. And what Jeremiah is telling them is, I want you to live. I want you to live every day. I want you to go about your life. And in fact, here's what I want your attitude to be towards the godless nation that you're living in. And that's in Jeremiah 29, verse 7.
But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare.
Now, this may be hard to do for them. They're living in this godless nation that give no concern for God or his people. And he says, I want you to pray for the welfare of the nation that you're living in, even though they're godless. Because if their welfare goes well, your welfare will go well, because you're living there, and I want to protect you in this godless nation. And I think sometimes we need to think about this ourselves. And, we always are praying for a godly country. Well, this country doesn't belong to God. The church belongs to God. This country is under the power and dominion of God. And I pray for it all the time. And I pray for the welfare of Christians. And I pray for the welfare of this country. And I wish that this country would be more godly. But I'm also realistic that we are less and less godly. And there are less and less Christians than I've ever seen before. And yet we have to live in exile in this country. And that's what they had to do. But he says, pray for the welfare of your country. And then he says, now be careful that you don't do this in verses 8 and 9.
For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord.
Now, here's what Jeremiah says. Be careful for false prophets. There are going to be people that come, and if you read in the chapters prior and before right there in Jeremiah, there's a false prophet he's talking about, but there were many, and they were saying, hey, don't worry about it. God's going to come and protect us. He's going to destroy Babylon. He's going to destroy any nation that comes after it. We're going to be delivered. And there were always those sorts of prophets. I can imagine it now. Don't fit into the culture. Don't live. Don't make plans. Just get ready, because the Messiah is coming back and there's going to be a big war. I know people that have lived their whole lives like that. I know people that 30 years ago were telling me that God will be back in about 5 years, and they started preparing for the big war. And I know others who got ready to fight it. And they started storing ammunition and guns in their basement, and they're ready to fight the war. I don't think that's the type of war that we're called to fight as Christians. I do think that there's a war that we're called to fight. I just don't think that's the one we're called to fight. We're going to talk about that here in a little while. But he says, be careful of false prophets. In our day and time, I've heard some of them. I've heard all sorts of crazy things, that God's going to do this and take this person out of power and put this person in power. And none of it happened. That means those are all false prophecies. And what we need to do is trust these prophecies. That's where we need to put our faith, and don't listen to the noise, and live every day trusting God. You can only control what you do each day. Now, as we continue the story, Esther is going to become queen. And it's just a great story. So here's what happens. He has this drunken party, and then in chapter 1, verse 10, it says that on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, and I read that on the seventh day when he had been drinking for 7 days and he was drunk, he had this idea, I want my queen Vashti to come because she's beautiful, and I want to parade her in front of everybody to show how beautiful the queen is. So he sent word for her, but the queen wouldn't come. She said, I'm not going to go see that drunken king and do his bidding to be paraded in front of people. So she refuses to come. And he was furious with her. And so he calls his eunuchs together, and they said, King, this is a problem. Because if you don't do something about this, women all over the land are going to be contemptuous towards their husbands. So he passes a law that she can never come before the king again in verse 1. In verse 19, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to become before the king. Now, we aren't going to use this verse for marriage counseling. I'm not condoning this, but this is what he did. He thought, well, I'll just pass a law and these women will behave from now on. I don't think that probably worked out real well for him. But it was an irreversible law, and it makes a point here that we'll come back to later, because when the Medes and Persians made a royal decree, you could not change it. And so now he needs a queen. So he calls all the eunuchs together in chapter 2 and says, I need a queen. It says, after those things, when the anger abated, he remembered that he had decreed his wife couldn't come before him again. That goes with my argument. He was probably drunk. He woke up the next day and thought, man, what did I do? So I'm going to have to get a new queen. I made a law. I can't change it. So all the virgins from the kingdom were called. And we find out that in chapter 2, verse 8, that when they went out and found them, that Esther was one of the ones chosen. I don't think this was Esther's dream for her life, by the way, to go live in a palace with a godless king that would just call her when he wanted to and would have a lot of other wives in his harem. I don't think that was her dream for her life. But she was compelled by the soldiers and the staff of the king to come, and she went. And then when she went, it says that when her turn came, that she went into the harem and they loved her and she was advancing. And then I thought this was a real interesting passage right here in verse 12. It says, now when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying. Now look at this. Here's the period of her beautifying: 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. For 12 months, they had to beautify themselves. You know, I was embarrassed after I read that. I thought, I'm never going to complain about my wife's bath again. She's always saying, well, you like it when I look pretty, but could you do it a little quicker? Well, she's fast. But that's how important beauty was to them. And so then after the period of beautification, in verse 17, she went before the king, and he loved Esther more than all the other women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then at the end of chapter 2, it says that Mordecai, who had raised her cousin, discovered a plot, hearing two of the eunuchs that wanted to kill the king, and he went and told Esther, and she passed it on to the king. They investigated it. In the end of chapter 2, it says that when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Now, we're laying story. We're going to get to some application here. I just want to lay the story. The story's great. Sometimes I think we get a little tired of reading the biblical story, but the biblical story is there for a reason. And it stands on its own, really. But now she is queen. He has been honored and written into the book of the records, but now the challenge is coming. And the challenge is that they're facing annihilation. So look at what happens in chapter 3 and verse 1. After these things, the king promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And so all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, he wouldn't listen to them. And so they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai was going to get away with it. And they said that Mordecai won't do it because he says he's a Jew. Now, Jeremiah says fit in, but it doesn't mean you worship somebody. It doesn't mean you bow down to other gods. And I think what he was telling them is, I'm a Jew. I'll do almost anything you ask, but I'm not going to bow down to a human being. I'm not going to worship even Haman. And so that's what he's telling them. And so that created a really big problem for Haman. And Haman became filled with fury, it says at the end of verse 5. And disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so he decides he's going to destroy all Jews in the entire kingdom. All of them. And what he does is he casts lots, and the word for lots in Hebrew is pur. He cast these lots until it landed on the 13th day of the 12th month and said, that's the day we're going to kill all the Jews in the whole kingdom. Now God's people are going to be really under attack. Now his promises are being challenged by an evil force. And so what happens is he goes to the king and he says, these people are weird, they're different. And he says in verse 8, their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it's not to the king's profit to tolerate them. And so if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they all be destroyed, and I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business. He paid the king off. The king wrote a decree and said that on the 13th day of the 12th month, we're going to kill every single one of those Jews. Now, we're going to start getting into some applications here, but there's something going on just besides Haman hating the Jews here. In fact, this goes way back into the Old Testament in Exodus when they were leaving Egypt and they were wandering around in Exodus chapter 17. They were fighting the Amalekites, and God says, I'm going to be fighting these Amalekites forever until I destroy them and blot them off the face of the earth. By the way, any of you know any Amalekites? I still know Egyptians. There's a lot of people I know about, but there's no more Amalekites. And so they went and fought this battle. And if you remember the story, whenever Moses raised his hands, they were winning, but he got tired. So Aaron and Hur came and held his hands up, and they won that battle. Well, later, they're still around when they get into the promised land, and King Saul is king in 1 Samuel 15. There's still a problem. And God tells Saul, I want you to go and kill every one of those Amalekites because they're a problem. And they're a bigger problem than you have any idea of at this second. And so he goes and kills them all, but guess what? Saul did not do what God told him to do. And you're going to see here an example of sometimes the smallest things we decide not to do come back to haunt us. We think, oh, I'll follow all the rules, but this one. I'm going to do everything God wants me to, but surely he won't care if. And surely he will overlook this, but what he does is he kills everybody but one person, King Agag. And guess what? Haman is a descendant of King Agag. I've always wondered, why does he wipe out a whole nation? Well, in this case, God knew that if one of them survived, they were going to come back and try and wipe out all the Israelites. Who would have guessed? There was this, somehow Satan was using this people to try and destroy God's people. And now the very descendant of King Agag has come back and he's trying to wipe out all the Jews. And so what happens next is we just have to realize that this is a cosmic battle. This is something bigger than Esther and Mordecai and Agag's son or great-great-great-grandson, whoever that is, Haman. This is something going on, and it's a battle between good and evil wants to destroy God's people. In Revelation chapter 12, it says this. It talks about the birth of the one Messiah, who I think he's talking about here, the birth of Jesus. And here's what he says. He says that when all this happened and Jesus was born, that's what I believe Revelation 12 is about, that at Jesus' death and resurrection, he conquered part of Satan, and he threw down all the angels that were with Satan down to earth. But it said, be careful, because when that happens, guess what he did? He pursued the woman, couldn't get her. So then it says in verse 17, so here's what Satan did. The dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus, and stood on the sand of the sea. So the dragon decided, I'm going to kill everybody that holds to the testimony of Jesus Christ and tries to obey the commandments of God. That's us. That battle has not gone away. And it won't until someday we're with God in heaven. So we sometimes get caught up in a lot of different things. But I'm going to tell you, the only one that matters is to realize that we're in a battle between good and evil would like to destroy us. And one of the ways it does is it just tricks us. In Ephesians chapter 6, it says this, in 10 and 12, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, put the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and the authorities and the cosmic powers of this present darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Esther reminds us the battle is spiritual, it's cosmic, it's with Satan himself. And we take things too lightly in our lives. We sometimes slide too many things by and ignore them because we think it's not that serious. We can only see the things around us, and we know what we want, and we're insecure and we're afraid, and we think God won't care, but it's a spiritual battle, and Satan will use every one of those little gray areas to ruin your life if he can. Because it is a spiritual battle. And in Revelation chapter 20, this is after the 1,000-year reign, and a lot of people have differences of opinion on what that means. In the churches of Christ, we tend to think that's a figurative reign that's going on right now until Satan's released and there's a final battle. Those who believe that the millennium is literal, about every world war decide, here it is. Here it is, World War I, the final battle, and then we're going to have the millennium. Here it is, World War II, the final battle. Here it is, Russia and Ukraine, it's coming. I don't know, God knows. But I do know one thing that says that when all that happens, that Satan's going to be released again. And here's what it says. He will deceive the nations, and they'll all gather to destroy God's people. That's what they're going to do. And then it says that fire from heaven will come down and destroy Satan in one final battle, and it'll be over. And then the new heavens and earth will come down. Now, here's what it doesn't say. And then when that day comes and they surround the bodies, all of God's people will grab their guns. All of God's people will go down in their basements and get their grenades and Molotov cocktails. It says that fire from heaven will come down, and God's going to solve this situation once and for all. So be aware that you're in a cosmic battle, but also be aware that you are required to take action. You have to do something. You're not allowed just to sit on a pew. You have to get involved in the spiritual battle. If you don't get involved in it, you're going to lose. If you don't get involved in it, you're going to pay the consequences of sin, which Jeff was talking about during class. You're going to pay some consequences. It may seem like you're not. It may seem like the sin's actually helping you, but you will always pay the consequences if you don't take action. And so back to our story in Esther. So what happens when Haman hears about this? Haman puts on sackcloth and ashes in chapter 4, 1 through 3, and he just goes to the gate of the city, and he can't go in to the gate of the palace because you can't go in if you're mourning, and he mourns. And Esther hears about it, and she's upset. So in verse 6, Hathach, who was one of the eunuchs that she was close to, went to ask him what was going on and to offer to help him and to help him, took him some clothes, say, please get these mourning clothes off so you can come back in the palace. And he said, there's no way. And he said, go back and tell her that the king has made an edict to destroy all Jews, and they didn't know she was a Jew. And so he's really disturbed, and then Hathach says to her, or Hathach says, well, the problem is if Esther goes and talks to the king, the law of the Medes and Persians are you can't go to the king unless you're invited. That's a problem. So I'll be glad to go and use my influence, but if I go to that king, he could kill me on the spot unless he lowers his scepter and invites me in. I'm a dead person. And here's what he says to her in verse 12 of chapter 4. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you'll escape from any more than all the other Jews. Don't think that because of your wealth or your retirement account or your comfortable home that you're going to escape Satan's designs to destroy your life. They're at risk of being exterminated, annihilated, but we're at risk of losing our spiritual life if we take this lightly. He says, don't think you'll escape the consequences of this. And who knows whether you have not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. And I don't know what you do with your life, but there's a spiritual battle going on. And if you're a Christian, you're meant to be a soldier of God's. You're meant to be fighting against evil. And so my question for you is, what role are you playing? Are you taking the water and food up to the front lines? Are you supplying ammunition to the people that are engaged in spiritual warfare? Are you engaged in spiritual warfare in your own life? Because if you're not engaged in spiritual warfare, you're going to be getting beat up by spiritual warfare. So you need to ask yourself, what is your calling? You can't just sit at home and say, I'm a good Christian. I go to church on Sunday mornings. I'm okay. That's not the life that we're called to live. It's a life of apathy and timidity that will suck your joy out of you, because when problems and tragedies come in your life, you won't have the spiritual fortitude to overcome them. And so Esther wakes up and realizes that's exactly right. And so she said, well, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold the fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or night. And my young women will also fast as you do, and then I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now there's courage. There is courage born out of moral conviction, but I'm going to start with a fast and prayer, because I'm going to need God's help to do this. In Ephesians chapter 6, here's something that every one of us can and should do. Everyone should take this action. It says, therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm, stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints and also for me, that words may be given to me, and opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. Which ones of those do you do tomorrow when you're at home alone or getting ready to go to bed? Which one of those do you do on Tuesday when you come home for work, or Wednesday morning as you're getting ready to go to work? Which one of these do you do every day of the week because you know you're in a battle and you know you need God's help? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. God calls us not to go through life in a good manner, but to go through life with the armor of God on so that we can conquer evil and not be subdued by it. And so that's what we're called to do. And so Esther now has a plan. It's a great plan. She goes to the king. Step one, he doesn't kill her. It's going good so far. He lets her come. He says, I'll give you anything you want. He really likes Esther. Turns out Esther becoming queen wasn't a bad thing after all. I can just imagine all the whispers. Did y'all know that that good Jewish girl went to the harem? I would have hid. I would have lied, said I hate the king. I would have done anything to get out of that. There's no telling what they thought, and now she's their only hope. God used what appeared probably to the conservative Jewish community to be something that was an anathema to them, and yet he used it to help provide salvation for the Jews. And she goes, and he loves her so much, I'll give you anything. I just want a banquet. And Haman comes, they have a great banquet. And at the end of the banquet, here's her plan. She goes, well, could we have another banquet tomorrow? I don't think she had a plan. She's just stalling. She's buying time. She doesn't know what to do. And when you don't know what to do something, right? When you don't know what to do something, and that's what she did. But here's what happens, is when you don't know what to do, trust God. Because Esther wasn't sure what she was doing. She wasn't sure how this was going to turn out. She didn't know how she could save her people. But here's what happened that night before the second banquet. When the king went to bed, it says in chapter 6, verse 1, that he could not sleep. Now, I wonder who that was. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds and the chronicles, and they were read before the king. I can't sleep. I want to do some good reading. Bring that great book of all the wonderful things that go on in my kingdom so I can feel good about myself again. And they brought it, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about the two eunuchs that were seeking to lay hands on the king. And the king said in verse 3, well, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And they said, nothing. You mean that guy saved my life and we did nothing? He said, bring that person here. Who's in the palace right now? Well, guess who was in the palace? Haman. He said, well, bring Haman in here. I need to talk to Haman. And he said, Haman, what should I do to honor a person that I appreciate more than anybody else? And Haman's thinking, well, let's see. We just had a banquet last night. It was me, the king, and the queen. I don't think there's anybody he likes better than me. I'm part of the family now. So he's thinking, let's see. I got some ideas. Let's have some royal robes that the king has worn, a horse the king has ridden. Let's get a royal crown, and let's put that on this man's head and clothe him with the king's clothes and lead him through the entire square and let everybody come out and say, this is the person we're going to exalt because he is the king's man. And so then to his great shock, he says, go do exactly what you said, but do it to Mordecai. Now Haman, who was without any doubt, Haman now is very, very concerned. Haman realizes this thing is turning on my head because now God's at work. And God's doing something that Esther couldn't do. He's doing something that Mordecai couldn't do, but he's doing something that only God can do. He's reversing the fortunes of his people. And so he goes and does that, and then he goes home and tells his wife what happened. She said, oh boy, you're in trouble. And we haven't even had the banquet yet. And now they come to the second banquet, and now Esther has confidence. Now Esther knows that God has come to their rescue. Now Esther knows that this thing is turning, and Esther tells the king, my life and the life of my people are at risk because this evil man right here, Haman, has decided that he is going to exterminate all of us. Now he has a little bit of a problem because he already made an irreversible law that he was going to destroy them all. And he sent a letter to all the provinces and said, on the 13th day of the 12th month, kill them all. But he's a little resourceful, so he makes another irreversible law that says all the Jews can protect themselves, so get weapons and organize and get ready to fight for yourself. So that's another irreversible law. And when that came from the king, I think they got the idea. And so look what happens in chapter 9. In chapter 9, it says, now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred, and the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. You know, Jeff asked a question in class, well, you know, why do people not respond to the message about sin? People don't believe in sin. They don't believe in God's word. They don't believe in right or wrong. We're in a situation now where some of our beliefs in Christians are so in opposition to some in our country that we really stand the risk of being persecuted down the road. We aren't now, not really. I mean, we have as much opportunity to persecute as be persecuted right now, but that could change. And I think of some of those differences. You know, we believe that life starts at conception, most of us, and that God miraculously has started this process, and we should protect life. And the world we live in says, no, it's not life until it comes out of the womb. Who cares? And we don't think that that's a very respectful or godly view of the life that God's created. We're at odds with our world about that. We believe that God created this earth, and he created it with order, and he created it male and female, and he created us differently, and males are a little different than females, and they're not the same thing, and sometimes they have different strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes they overlap, but we believe that God created us this way, but the world says no. It doesn't matter what your body looks like. You can decide in your mind what you are. Makes no sense to me, but that's what they say. And we live in a world that says that Jesus was just a good man, pretty good man. And we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that he died on a cross and was raised from the dead, and that he's sitting at God's right hand. No wonder some people don't like Christians these days. And there's some things that we may have to suffer for down the road, but we know that no matter what happens, that God's in charge. And at the end of all this, in chapter 9, verse 19 through 22, it says that Mordecai wrote all this down and sent down all these letters to all of Israel and said, from now on this day when we were going to be killed, we're going to have a feast, and it's called the Feast of Purim, or the Feast of Lots. He cast lots to kill us all, and the day we were supposed to be killed, we destroyed our enemies instead, because God's great reversal showed that he's the one in charge. And so we're supposed to wear this garment of faith, that God can reverse even what seems to be lost, that God will help us overcome even when it seems that there's no salvation left, that God is in control even when everything seems wicked and dark. We are supposed to wear this garment that reminds us that God did it before and he can do it again. Next week, when we celebrate Easter, which will be a break from this, it will be a great reminder of the salvation that God offers. But you have to believe in it. In World War II, there was this interesting instance. The Germans were already beginning to take some of the countries around them, and they were getting close to France, and British sent some help for them, and they were in Belgium, and they looked at the Germans, and the French decided, well, they're not going to come through the Ardennes forest because there's too many hills and trees there. And it would slow them down. It would be dangerous for them. So they're going to come from one of these other areas. And so they didn't have any protection there. And then aerial surveillance came back and said, y'all, there's all these tanks and war machines coming through the Arden Mountains. They said, nah, you must have, there's no way they're coming. We know they're coming one of these two directions. You must have misseen that. They didn't believe their own eyes. And sometimes we don't believe our own eyes when we read this book. We don't believe that the power of God is also for you and me. We don't believe that if I do what's right, I'll be blessed. We believe that I'll find the blessing on my own and I'll deliver myself. But God says, no, trust me and I'll deliver you and bless you. And guess what? Those Germans came right through those Arden Mountains. And no one was there to greet them. And they cut right through and cut off all the army that was in Belgium. And pretty quickly they surrendered because they didn't believe their own eyes. So I ask you today with the eyes of faith to believe that you're in a spiritual battle. To believe that there's a great reversal coming one day if we put our faith in Jesus Christ. And to believe that salvation is only in Him. If we can encourage you, if we can pray for you, if we can help you fight that battle, if you want to start that battle today, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.